The Director of R&D Budget and Policy Program for the American Association for the Advancement of Science, where he is a regular source of information analyses on past, present, and future science budget for policymakers and the science community. Matt earned a master's degree in public policy with a focus on science and technology policy at George Mason and a BA in journalism from Ithaca College. I'm pleased to introduce Matt Hourihan.
So hello folks, good afternoon. So I'm going to try to move quickly here because I know we don't have a ton of time, but my job in the next few minutes is to give you a very quick overview of the current state of affairs regarding the fiscal situation in government and how that may impact S&T funding next year and over the next several years. I also need to warn you, when I'm giving presentations these days, I have to give a standard preface. My wife is 36 weeks pregnant now. Got my phone on me, so if it rings, I have to answer it. So if I answer the phone right out of the room, don't take it personally. So having said that, the story when we talk about science and technology funding, that story always has to start with the overall story of the discretionary budget. The discretionary budget being the part of the federal budget that Congress allocates through the appropriations process every year. And the discretionary budget is under pressure kind of at two different levels. First level is the very big picture, as you see here. And you can see over time the changing composition in the federal budget. I've got discretionary spending in red and blue, it's defense and non-defense, and then mandatory spending in gray. And you'll note that mandatory spending has grown quite a bit over the past few decades relative to the rest of the budget. When I say mandatory spending, that primarily means entitlement programs. So between occasional expansions of those programs, an aging population, rising healthcare costs, mandatory spending has come to dominate the federal budget in this day and age. And as that has grown, it's meant a decline in discretionary spending, especially defense discretionary spending, although non-defense lately has been coming down as well. And these trends are likely to continue in the long run with increasing growth in mandatory spending, increasing decline in discretionary spending. If we're not already, we will soon be at a post-World War II low in the discretionary budget as a share of the economy. And again, this growth in mandatory spending is going to continue, is expected to continue for many decades as entitlement programs continue to dominate the federal budget. So that means a declining discretionary budget, and that matters for S&T because science and technology tends to track the overall discretionary budget very closely. In fact, R&D, since about 1980, R&D hasn't really changed a whole lot as a share of the discretionary budget. It's usually around 11, 12, 13%. It fluctuates in that range. So as discretionary spending goes, so goes science funding. And I should note, while sequestration didn't create this situation. You can see the impact of sequestration just in these last several years here. It doesn't create the decline in discretionary spending. It does accelerate it. So even if we were to lift and just completely wipe away the current sequestration level spending caps over the next 4 years, because they're in place until 2021, we'd still be looking at a declining discretionary budget, just a slightly slower decline on that front. So that's something to keep in mind. This is a tough fiscal situation that the science community is going to be dealing with for many years. When I say many years, I mean decades. So that's kind of the big picture. The more immediate stressor on the discretionary budget are the current spending caps, which have been in place since the 2012 fiscal year. So to understand what's going on here, we've got to go back through the mists of time, back to 2011 to the Budget Control Act, which put in place, you can see here, a couple of discretionary spending baselines. The higher baseline, the gray dotted line, that's the pre-sequestration spending baseline. And then the lower spending baseline is the sequester baseline, and that's the one that actually ended up kicking in, becoming actual law. We can get into some of the background on why that happened and what actually happened if you're interested during the Q&A. Suffice to say, that lower spending baseline, again, is where the original Budget Control Act envisioned discretionary spending to be in, from FY 2013 through FY 2021, representing, as you can see, a pretty steep decline. I mean, even before we got to FY 2012 and the Budget Control Act of the 2011 calendar year, discretionary spending was already coming down starting in FY 2011. So again, the Budget Control Act accelerated the trend that we saw previously. Fortunately, in the time that these spending caps have been in place, Congress has acted every year to actually raise them. So you can see here, actual funding has actually been every year above that sequestration level spending baseline. And just to be clear, sequestration only means what happened in FY 2013. A sequester is an across-the-board reduction in spending authority and budget authority. So what we're dealing with now isn't another sequestration technically. It's simply sequester-level spending. It makes a difference because we're not talking about, unless something unlikely happens, we're not talking about across-the-board cuts. We're talking about a lower, tighter spending cap. So in terms of what actually has happened since FY 2012, in the 2013 fiscal year, we got the American Taxpayer Relief Act. And then since then, we've had two different iterations of the Bipartisan Budget Act. All of these have served to raise the discretionary spending caps. And this has had a positive impact, a very clear positive impact on science agency budgets, as we'll see here in a few moments. So we're in the FY 2017 fiscal year right now. Now, you'll note in FY 2017, it looks like a decline. Discretionary spending overall was basically flat in the current fiscal year in 2017. But this, when you factor in inflation, we're actually talking about a roughly almost 2% decline adjusted for purchasing power. And this has had an impact on appropriations so far. Now, setting aside what actually may happen, where it looks like we're heading for another continuing resolution that could last into March or April or even May. They're supposed to be releasing that today, and they may already have. So far in the 2017 appropriations, we've seen very modest, one might say uninspiring outcomes for science. Lots of agencies with flat funding or very small sub-inflation increases, as one would expect given the relatively tight discretionary situation. And I can't, so that's FY 2017, and beyond FY 2017, once we get to FY 2018, the current spending deals run out. And so in FY 2018, we're back to that sequestration level spending baseline. So again, this doesn't mean a huge round of cuts. Discretionary spending is slated to come down by about 0.5 percentage point. Although again, when you factor in inflation, we're talking about a decline adjusted for purchasing power of, say, 2.5%. So, FY 2018, under current law as of right now, on that sequestration level spending path, is likely going to be another very tight year for science funding all around. And I really can't emphasize enough how central the discretionary budget is for science spending, period, for agencies across the board. And to illustrate, we're going to go all the way back in time to the end of the Clinton administration and the doubling of the NIH budget. NIH doubled between 1998 and 2003. It's very well known, much talked about. But it wasn't just congressional generosity that led to that doubling. You can see here what actually was happening in the non-defense discretionary budget. And people usually don't talk about this at all in relation to the NIH increase. But as NIH was increasing, well, the discretionary budget was increasing right along with it. In fact, Congress, at this point, 1998, Congress was coming off almost a decade of spending caps. So we're actually going to find ourselves in a similar situation in a few years, assuming Congress doesn't extend the current spending caps, which are slated to run through 2021. But again, you can see, the discretionary budget was increasing, NIH was increasing along with it. And look what also happened at that time. NSF and the Office of Science, to pick two agencies, Office of Science at DOE also saw some pretty steady growth over those years. Wasn't universal. Poor NASA, you can see, didn't fare so well. But generally speaking, a rising discretionary budget serves to be a rising tide that tends to lift all boats. Unfortunately, an increase in discretionary spending means a decline or an increase in science agency budgets. The reverse is also true. As discretionary spending comes down, or is constrained, science agency budgets tend to come down along with it. So again, you can see here. So the discretionary spending caps, that trend line, it's the same data set you just saw a couple of slides ago from 2010 through 2017. Although this is all reflected as a percentage change from FY 2010 levels, which again is when the big declines in discretionary spending and the declines in science agency funding really began to take effect. And again, you can see what's happened. I mean, the discretionary budget has been the center of gravity around which science agencies, science programs have tended to cluster. Some have fared better than others. NSF, you can see, has done a little bit better. Big driver for that was the presence of Frank Wolf on the Virginia representative on the Appropriations Subcommittee responsible for NSF, big supporter of NSF, and was able to secure some smaller reductions, let's say. Other agencies didn't fare nearly so well. You can kind of see for yourselves how things have gone. USDA R&D is near the bottom. You can see big declines coupled with a recovery. And again, you can see what's happened since 2013. That was the sequestration year. Since then, we've seen a recovery in discretionary spending and a recovery in agency budgets along with it. And then to zoom in on environmental science agencies in particular over this time, because I know that'll be of the most interest to you all. So again, the discretionary spending caps, the y-axis is different, but the data for the discretionary spending caps is exactly the same as the last slide. And you can see how some of the big environmental science programs have fared over time. And just to quickly run through these, what's actually happened and what may happen going forward. We'll start with earth science. You can see very much an anomaly since the 2010 fiscal year. Big growth. No other or very few other science programs have seen the kind of growth that NASA Earth Science has seen over these past several years, including other science programs within NASA. Heliophysics, astrophysics, planetary science, none of them have fared nearly as well as Earth Science has. Part of that is prioritization by the current administration, of course. You could also call part of that very much the Mikulski effect, given the strong support of Barbara Mikulski on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Mikulski is based in Maryland and a big supporter of NASA Earth Sciences, although she is retiring after this year. So it certainly stands to reason that NASA Earth Science is going to be facing some pretty severe headwinds going forward. When we talk about Earth Science, there's really, I'm sure you've all seen the recommendations from the Trump transition team on what to do about NASA Earth Science, and there's really two policy decisions underlying those recommendations. Number one is how much should we fund, and number two is who should fund it, where should it be located. Starting with the latter first, the idea has been floated to redirect Earth Science to NOAA and the National Science Foundation. I think this is frankly pretty unlikely given Congress. It wasn't that long ago that the Senate Appropriations Committee actually tried to do the reverse and move NOAA satellite programs over to NASA. NOAA for years has struggled with some of their satellite activities, cost overruns and management issues, and appropriators still are very concerned about a lot of those programs. So it seems pretty unlikely that they pursue such a move. In addition, NSF just has very little experience with space activity. So that piece of it, I think, is pretty unlikely to actually happen. The other question, how much should we fund? Again, that's perhaps cuts are certainly a little bit more likely. Suffice to say, at the same time, a lot of the reaction, there's been a lot of concern about NASA Earth Science actually being zeroed out, and that seems like a pretty unlikely state of affairs. Because even if congressional Republicans, wanted to see Earth Science come down from a funding perspective, and they certainly do, many of them do anyway. Zeroing out a program like Earth Science would be that's a pretty big step, and I don't know that anybody would actually want to see that outside of the administration. So, no, I shouldn't say. Okay, not that nobody would want to see that, but most folks, I think, wouldn't want to see that. But again, so then the question becomes what kinds of funding reductions should we expect in Earth Science? At the very least, one might expect earth science to come back down to the level of its other, other science programs within the NASA science mission. We could see some pretty sizable cuts, but again, it's very tough to predict, and who really knows? And the absence of Polsky may certainly not bode well for earth science. So NOAA, that's specifically the Office of Oceanic and Atmospheric Research at NOAA, and you can see it was pretty well whacked between FY 2010 and FY 2013, but then has recovered nicely. Maybe the thing to note there is that the recovery has been entirely driven by two of its three major programs: ocean and Great Lakes research and weather and atmospheric research. NOAA's climate research activities specifically haven't actually recovered from those big cuts. They've come back a little bit, but there's a big disparity now between climate research and other research activities at NOAA. Fully expect that to continue to be a major lightning rod in Congress. DOE BER, that's the Biological and Environmental Research Program, the Office of Science at DOE. And that's an odd one in that Republican appropriators tend to support and prioritize the biological side of the shop there. Climate research, environmental research tends to be singled out and attacked with cuts, or at the very least flat funding. The administration has tried to stand up some new climate modeling activities and other things in that program, and hasn't really gotten anywhere. Again, likely that's a dynamic that's likely to continue in the new Congress. U.S. Geological Survey, actually kind of odd how it's almost perfectly tracked the overall discretionary budget up to FY 2016. Within USGS, there doesn't tend to be a whole lot of fluctuation program by program, and mission area by mission area. They all tend to move roughly at the same pace, and they all tended to follow this trajectory for the most part. Core science activities may have come down a bit, and natural hazards, I think, has fared a little bit better than the rest. But for the most part, they all tend to move together. Lastly, EPA. NSF Geosciences. Again, it's been a target lately, and I'm sure it'll continue to be a target in the next Congress. And geosciences has actually declined. You noticed in the earlier slide, NSF didn't look so bad. Geoscience has actually come down more than any other of the 6 research directorates at NSF. Lastly, EPA, S&T, I'm not going to say a whole lot. I mean, EPA has been an obvious target for years and will certainly continue to be. And again, a lot of EPA programs tend to move, in the same. I mean, most of these agencies, I think you can say, most of these programs, I think you can say, a lot of the sub-programs tend to move together in unison with the overall discretionary budget, with overall agency budgets. Although, again, I've mentioned a few of the exceptions. So where do we go from here? And you saw this slide earlier. So I mentioned FY 2018. As of right now, current law is set to revert back to that sequestration level spending in FY 2018, which will likely mean another tight year for science funding, perhaps some cuts, coupled with some targeted increases. In terms of what actually is going to happen, I think maybe the best way to think about it is there are really three options, or three policy choices that Congress and the next administration are going to have. First option would be increased discretionary spending overall, as they have for the past several years. They'd have to find a way to pay for it, but we may see a defense and non-defense increase. That would be one option. Another option would be what President-elect Trump has campaigned on, cutting the non-defense budget to increase defense spending. Third option would be nothing happens and current law just stays in effect as it is. Worst case scenario for science would certainly be a cut to the non-defense discretionary budget and an increase in defense spending. I actually think this is pretty unlikely to happen, just for the simple fact that Democrats still have 46 or 47 seats in the Senate right now. So they're going to be able to block any substantive legislation that attempts to make those changes to the underlying spending caps. The reconciliation process probably, as I understand it, it can get a bit complicated, but as I understand it, the reconciliation process isn't really a viable strategy for making for making changes to these spending caps. So the idea that non-defense discretionary spending is going to come down more than it's slated to, I would call that unlikely. Given the ability of Democrats to block those changes in the Senate. Although keep in mind, in 2018, Democrats are facing a much less favorable electoral map. So it's actually, not outside the realm of possibility they could lose that filibuster-proof minority, in a couple of years, but that's still a ways out. So if a cut to non-defense discretionary spending is unlikely, that leaves us with the possibility of current law, as you see here, or an increase. I think an increase in both defense and non-defense spending, it's unlikely, but there is some reason to be, there's some reason to not completely rule it out as a possibility. Certainly Democrats would like to see an increase in both defense and non-defense spending. Republicans are not monolithic on this. Some would be happy to increase both, provided it was paid for somehow. Because the other increases you see up here in prior years have all been paid for to varying degrees. So, some Republicans would be happy to increase that spending. Some would want to keep spending as it is. So there could be some unpredictably positive developments on that front. Although it seems like it could be a tough battle. So, it's entirely, to me, as of right now, it seems the most likely scenario is just what we see here. Another year of mildly declining funding in the discretionary budget overall with associated impacts in science spending. But, again, one speculates and prognosticates at one's own peril. It's there's a lot more questions than answers at this point, and we'll see what happens. So I'll wrap up there. Happy to take that. We have a few minutes for questions. I should also note, if you're on the 2017 appropriations front, we put together a couple of months ago a roundup on where things stand right now. Nothing has really changed to date, though it may change depending on what happens with this CR that they're trying to get done this week. But you can follow that link or simply Google what you see up there, and you'll find it. It's got a little bit more detail on what's happening right now, or what has happened in appropriations for USGS and EPA and some other agencies. So, and happy to take your questions.